Well, summer's here again, and it's time for another Zukiworld Overland adventure. For this year's trip, Eric Bewley from Zukiworld sat down at his computer and planned out a 5-day-long overland-style trip for us that ended at the border convergence of Idaho, Wyoming, and Utah. Along the way, we saw hundreds of points of interest, everything from lakes, waterfalls, canyons, cliffs, scenic vistas, fossil beds, national monuments, geysers, nuclear reactors, rockets, and even Napoleon Dynamite's house. Since this trip is the last border convergence trip that we have planned, we decided to call it the last one over. The route that Eric had planned for us begins at the Golden Spike National Historic Monument in Promontory, Utah, and ends in the town of Cary, Idaho. In between the start and finish, Eric had planned 5 days of adventure. Although it's impossible to completely cover the entire adventure in a short video, I do hope that you'll enjoy my footage from this trip. I'm getting ready to roll out from my house here on the Oregon coast. Now, this is the vehicle I'll be taking on the trip. So this is a 1996 Suzuki Sidekick Sport, and I've got several YouTube videos of projects up that I've completed on this thing already. So here's just a basic quick overview. I'm running a Suzuki Aereo J23 2.3 liter engine under the hood. It's a pretty good power increase over the stock power plant. I've got twin electric cooling fans there, which work pretty good when it gets pretty hot out. And of course, working air conditioning. That's key for where we're going to be going. I've got a custom front bumper here. It's got a Warn M8000 winch on it, flush mounted LED light bars that are tied in with the high beams, and very useful thing here, the end bells on the bumper are air tanks. They're air reservoirs for an electric air compressor. I got my air check right here. And so I carry a tire plug kit as well as a spare tire, and I have the ability to air my tires up and down as necessary or repair flats on the trail. So suspension is a custom lift that was made by Bob Tupper of Creation Fabrication. I got Fox dual rate coilovers in the front, custom lower A arms, custom trailing arms, and coil springs for the rear. And up front, I've got my air compressor switch here. I've got my driving light switch, so down turns the LED lights on, center position is off, and up ties them in with the high beams, so they come on whenever the high beams come on. So this is the route that we're going to be going right here, and you can see the planned tracks and the waypoints, and I've got all these map tiles cached so I don't rely on internet service while I'm out there. Transfer case has got a trail gear twin stick on it, and then I'm running the low 4:16:1 gear ratio in that. And I've got a dual band ham radio in here, and I've got that mounted where the ashtray would be. And I've actually got that plugged into my stereo, so when I'm driving down the road at high speeds, I can actually hear someone talk on the radio and talk back without straining to hear the conversation. And in this vehicle, I've also got a Wilson cell booster. So the antenna for the cell booster is actually up behind the stereo. So I've got kind of a cell boosted bubble right here in the middle. It covers my phone and my tablet pretty well. And that actually works pretty good. It doesn't create cell service, but it adds 1 or 2 bars to what might already be there. And I found over the years that works great for these backcountry trips. And then I've got my Spot personal locator right there. That's going to be sending our GPS location up to a map that few people have access to. And then I've also got my handheld ham radio right here for communications out on the trail, just in case I need to communicate with someone while I'm on foot. And that's about it. Let's button this thing up and hit the road. The plan for day 1 was for everyone to meet at the Golden Spike National Historic Monument in Promontory, Utah. However, all of us had a long drive in front of us, and Gil and I were the only 2 people to make it to the monument before it closed. So we enjoyed a tour there, and especially enjoyed the machine shop where they have working steam locomotives. From there we headed north toward ATK Orbital's Rocket Garden. At the Rocket Garden they have on display hundreds of different rocket motors, missiles, satellite thrusters, and even solid rocket boosters for the space shuttle. Oh, and if you're going to visit the rocket garden, please don't climb into the nozzle. Once we were done at the rocket garden, we headed north toward the Curlew campground to camp for the night. After catching up with some old friends, a quick swim in the lake to wash off the dust, and a good night's sleep, we headed out the next morning. Well, day one of the Zukiworld Last One Over Overland adventure is underway. Most of the guys made it in last night. A couple people showed up a little bit late, but we all got a good night's sleep and a good start this morning. I got some great weather. We just left the Curlew campground at the Stone Creek Reservoir, and we're looking at a couple 100 miles today to today's campsite. A little bit of pavement, mostly dirt roads, but ought to be a good trip. We got a good group of people and some great vehicles, and looking forward to seeing some pretty cool points of interest along the way. First up was a stop in the town of Malad for fuel, ice, and supplies. A few more miles on the interstate, and we turned off-road. Unfortunately, the route that we had planned didn't really work out. It narrowed down to a 2-track for a side-by-side, and we elected to turn around instead of adding pinstriping to our vehicles. Before we turned around, we were surprised by a lifted Suzuki Sidekick Sport that pulled up. A friendly wave and a couple of introductions, and we met Richard. Richard was on his own little adventure. He lives in Texas, but had purchased a Sidekick Sport up in Seattle, flew up there, turned some wrenches on it, did some camping and off-roading in the mountains in Washington, and then pulled up our GPS route and ran it in reverse with the hopes of running into us. As luck would have it, he did. He joined our group and stuck with us for the rest of the adventure. Next up was the town of Preston, Idaho. We stopped and fueled up the vehicles, and then did a drive-by at the house used in the filming of the movie Napoleon Dynamite. I couldn't help myself, and in a departure from good ham radio operating practices, I picked up the microphone and in my best Napoleon Dynamite voice, "Come on, Tina, you fat lard! Come and get some dinner!" Next up was the Oneida Narrows and Oneida Reservoir. This was an amazing scenic drive. However, lots of other people also thought this was an amazing scenic drive, and there were just too many people here for us. So we enjoyed the scenery and continued on down the road. It was getting late in the day, so we started looking for someplace to set up camp. The topo map showed a promising area of 2-track to the northeast, so that's the way we headed. After about an hour of driving up a rocky road in low range, we found an excellent secluded campsite on top of a windswept hill. The next day would prove to be a real challenge for the vehicles, spotters, and drivers. The first few miles were okay, with just a few downed trees to winch out of the way and a few creek crossings. The trail became progressively narrower and narrower, and pretty soon it became apparent that this was designed for four-wheelers, not for full-size vehicles. The trail was difficult enough in my Sidekick, and it was one of the smallest vehicles in the group. It was even more difficult for Eric in his Equator, and just about impossible for the largest vehicle in our group. Now I know you're looking at this vehicle and saying, "Hey, that's not a Suzuki," and you're right, it's not. Meet David. David's a longtime participant of Zukiworld Adventures. and he has plenty of off-road experience, from Moab to the Rubicon, off-road desert racing, and everything in between. David decided to bring his entire family along on this trip, and there just isn't a Suzuki that's big enough to accommodate 4 kids, his wife, and a 2-week-old kitten that they brought along. So he decided to bring his Suburban, complete with a tent-topped adventure trailer. And today I kept pretty busy running a handsaw, cutting brush on the sides of the trail to minimize the amount of paint damage that was done to the vehicles, so I didn't get a whole lot of video footage. But it was amazing watching David pilot the Suburban and trailer through this stretch, up on 2 wheels and 10-point turns every few feet. It took us almost 10 hours to drive just 6 miles, but David emerged from the other side without ever having to pull a winch cable and with just relatively minor scuffs on the running boards and paint in the Suburban. At the end of the day, we were all happy to have made it off the trail in one piece. Never has an 8-foot wide dirt 2-track road looked so amazing. We had all had enough driving for the day, so we headed toward the Paris Ice Cave to try and find a good campsite for the evening. Oh yeah, and you know that pinstriping I was worried about on day 1? Yeah, not so worried about it anymore. The phrase of the day was, it'll buff out. We were all hot, tired, and dusty, so we picked the first good pullout we could find and set up camp for the night. First stop the next morning would be the Paris Ice Cave. Once we were done at the Paris Ice Cave, I headed to Montpelier to get some supplies and to try and fix the VHF radio antenna that I had broken the day before. I've just left the town of Paris, Idaho. We had a pretty significant day of four-wheeling yesterday. I think it took us about 10 hours to go around 6 miles. Really wasn't too much for the sidekicks in the group, but the bigger vehicles definitely had a little bit more difficulty. Spent a lot of time cutting brush and winching logs out of the trail. So the bigger vehicles could make it through. But no problems, everyone eventually made it through, and I'm on my way now to Minnetonka Ice Cave and then Bear Lake after that. So got a few pavement miles and some dirt road miles in front of me. Sidekick's running great, weather's awesome, and tomorrow's the 4th of July, so looking forward to the last couple of days of the last one over. On another note, I know the 4th of July is coming up and all, but there's American flags everywhere out here. People have them in their front yards, flying on their trucks, on four-wheelers, just everywhere there's American flags. A lot of patriotism around here. Kind of like it. America. Once we were done swimming at Bear Lake, it was time to hit the trail and head for our goal, the border of Idaho, Wyoming, and Utah. About 1,500 miles of driving, and our goal is in sight. We're only about 10 miles away from the border convergence, and I'm excited to check this one off the list. When we arrived at the corner marker, we found a steep hill climb. Although all the vehicles attempted it, only Eric's Equator and my Suzuki Sidekick made it to the top. The steep grade, loose rock, and frame twister type holes kept the vehicles with open differentials at the bottom of the hill. We took a few minutes to snap some photos of the monument, were all fooled by a fake $100 bill in the geocache, and then I had to do my obligatory plank on the corner marker pose. The sun was getting low in the sky and the vehicles were getting low on fuel, so we headed out in search of a gas station and a campsite for the night. Finding a campsite would prove to be more difficult than anyone thought. After around 100 miles, we stumbled on a secluded little area at about 1 o'clock in the morning, just east of Fossil Butte National Monument. We were all exhausted, and everyone turned in as soon as the tents were put up. Tomorrow was the 4th of July, and we were all looking forward to Soda Springs. After a stop at Fossil Butte National Monument and a long day on the trail, we made it to Soda Springs. We all enjoyed hot showers in our hotel rooms, and I dropped a few quarters in the local car wash to wash the trail dust out of the Sidekick. After a nice sit-down dinner, we headed to the local park to watch the 4th of July fireworks. We all enjoyed a good night's sleep, went out to breakfast, and then spent a few hours seeing the sights around Soda Springs.
here in the 70s.
Once we were done at Soda Springs, we hit the road. First up was a stop in the ghost town of Chesterfield. Once we were done at Chesterfield, we made tracks for the town of Bone. It was a particularly hot day, and Eric lured us with promises of ice cream. Unfortunately, when we got there, the restaurant informed us that they had stopped carrying ice cream years ago, so we settled for a plate of nachos instead, and those were pretty good. Once we were done with our lunch, it was time to hit the pavement and head to our last stop, EBR-1. EBR-1 is the world's first operating nuclear breeder reactor and is located near the town of Idaho Falls. This facility was used for Navy nuclear prototype testing and is largely off limits. However, the EBR-1 facility itself is open to public tours. Outside of the EBR-1 building are Heater 1 and Heater 2. These were nuclear reactors that were built with the intent of installing them in aircraft, and they were operational and connected to turbine engines. However, the project never saw completion, and they now sit as largely complete reactors for public viewing. Now, because of my background as a Navy nuclear electronics technician and reactor operator, I was extremely interested in taking a look at this place. Unfortunately, we arrived there right at closing and weren't able to take a tour inside of the facility, so I had to settle for some photographs outside. And that was it. The end of the Zukiworld Last One Over trip. I had 716 miles to go and work scheduled the day after tomorrow, so I pointed the Sidekick west and headed home.